Black CEO denied first-class seat chaos. Erupts as 9 staff are fired instantly. But what if the real chaos wasn't loud? What if it came quietly, through silence, dignity, and a single woman who refused to surrender the seat she rightfully earned? On a calm morning flight, Amina Caldwell, one of the most powerful CEOs in America, was asked to give up her first-class seat without reason. No explanation, no apology, just a quiet assumption that she didn't belong. She said nothing. She got off the plane. And by the end of the month, 9 airline staff had been fired. A global movement had begun, and boardrooms across the country were forced to answer one impossible question. Why are some seats still seen as a privilege instead of a right? This isn't just a story about airplanes. It's a story about power, perception, and the quiet fire inside a woman who had been underestimated one time too many. Are you ready to find out what really happened at 30,000 feet? Then buckle up, because this journey might just change how you see the world. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you never miss another powerful story. Let's begin. Amina Caldwell walked with measured steps through the polished halls of Terminal B at George Bush Intercontinental Airport. It was just past 6 a.m, and the terminal was beginning to stir with the sleepy hum of early travelers. Her rolling carry-on glided behind her effortlessly. Her posture was tall, her movements fluid, but deliberate. She had learned to carry herself that way, not with arrogance, but assurance. The kind of assurance that let her blend in when she needed to, and stand out when it mattered. Her black slacks were pressed. Blazer a soft navy blue. No designer logos, just clean lines, sensible heels, and a silver chain around her neck bearing a tiny, engraved compass. It had been a gift from her father the day she got her pilot's license, long before she ever stepped foot in a boardroom. At Gate B-19, a line was forming for Flight 308 to Boston. The sign above the counter blinked, "Now boarding Group 1, First Class and Elite Status." Amina stepped forward. The gate agent was young, maybe mid-20s, with a headset slightly askew and nails freshly painted in coral pink. Her name tag read Haley. She glanced at Amina, then at the boarding pass on the phone being extended toward her. There was a beat, a hesitation. Haley smiled, but her fingers paused over the scanner. "Just one moment, please," she said, eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Amina didn't flinch. Of course. The moment stretched, invisible but heavy. Haley glanced back at the screen, then at the boarding pass again. "You're in seat." 1D, she asked, as though she hadn't just read it aloud. "Yes," Amina answered, gently. "Group 1. Haley nodded quickly, then scanned it. A single beep, clear and crisp. "All right, thank you. Boarding is down the jet bridge to the left." Amina smiled faintly and stepped forward. Behind her, someone sighed impatiently. A man in a gray hoodie muttered, "These priority lines are so slow now." A woman with a coach bag whispered to her husband, "Probably one of those voucher upgrades." Amina heard it all. She always did. The metal bridge leading to the aircraft felt colder than usual. She adjusted her bag strap, felt the pull of her own breath. She wasn't angry, just bracing. People didn't need to shout to make you feel small. Sometimes it was in the pause before a scan, the slight double-check, the glances that questioned your presence. But she was used to it. She had spent the last 2 decades building a life around walking into rooms where people didn't expect her, then leaving those rooms better than she found them. Today was no different. At least, she hoped it wouldn't need to be. Inside the aircraft, the first-class cabin glowed with soft morning light filtering through oval windows. She walked to seat 1D, stowed her bag neatly, and sat down without fuss. Her movements were practiced, quiet, but unmistakably confident. The man across the aisle gave her a nod, then returned to his newspaper. A young flight attendant passed by, smile tight and brief. Amina opened her e-reader, but her mind wasn't on the page. She noticed the way Reed, a tall, clean-cut male flight attendant, stopped mid-stride when he saw her seated. He looked at her, blinked, then turned abruptly toward the galley. Moments later, he re-emerged with another flight attendant, a woman in her late 30s. Her bun was tight, lipstick deep rose, Jocelyn Hart. Her name tag said. They didn't speak to Amina at first. They just hovered, whispered. Then Jocelyn stepped forward, voice polite but clipped. "Good morning, ma'am. May I take a quick look at your boarding pass?" Amina looked up. Her voice was even. It was scanned at the gate, but of course. She reached into her side pocket and handed over the phone. Screen glowing with the Virion Air app and a clearly labeled seat 1D, first class. Jocelyn studied it longer than necessary. "Thank you. I'll just be a moment," she said, walking away with the device still in her hand. Amina didn't reach for it. She just sat back in her seat and waited. Across the aisle, the man in 1C shifted uncomfortably. There was a time when Amina might have said something, might have pushed back, named her job title, her position, but not anymore. Silence. She'd learned, had gravity, and sometimes it spoke loudest. She glanced out the window. She thought about her mother. There had been a time, when she was 9, when her mother had been asked to step out of line at a bank. "We'll help you after these customers," they'd said, as two white couples were ushered past. Her mother had smiled then to calmly, heartbreakingly, and waited. Amina never forgot that. Not because her mother made a scene, but because she didn't. Because she refused to let her dignity be dented by the smallness of someone else's expectations. That memory lived in her even now in 1D, in the air-conditioned chill of an aircraft not yet fully boarded. Jocelyn returned. "Thank you. Ms. Caldwell," she said. "There just seemed to be a system glitch, but you're all set." The phone was handed back with a tight smile. Amina returned the same smile, even controlled. Jocelyn lingered half a second longer than she needed to. Then she walked away. Amina placed the phone back in her pocket. The man beside her leaned over. He was well-dressed, early 60s, glasses perched on his nose. "I travel a lot," he said, voice low. That didn't seem right. Amina turned slightly, eyes calm. "No," she said. "It didn't." He paused, then looked down at his coffee. "Glad you're still here." Amina nodded. "Me too." But something in her chest whispered otherwise, because she knew how turbulence really worked. Sometimes it didn't shake the plane. It stirred the room before takeoff. Amina shifted slightly in her seat as boarding continued around her. The hum of passengers entering the plane created a low murmur, punctuated by the soft thud of carry-ons in overhead bins and the occasional polite greeting from the crew. She pulled her tray table down and set her coffee on it, hands wrapped around the warm cup more for grounding than comfort. Her eyes flicked toward the front of the cabin, where Jocelyn and Reed stood, still whispering, still glancing back at her. They hadn't said another word since returning her boarding pass. But something lingered. The atmosphere didn't feel quite right. Not tense exactly, just off-kilter. Like a room that had been rearranged just slightly enough to make you hesitate before sitting down. She opened her e-reader again, but her eyes skimmed the page without registering a word. Her mind was working beneath the surface. Not anxious, not fearful, just alert. She'd been here before. Not here as in first class. She'd spent years flying coast to coast for meetings, speaking engagements, and equity summits. But here as in this place where you are watched too long, asked too many questions, asked for proof when others are simply believed. She knew what followed too. Often a mistake, a mix-up, a system glitch, an apology that never quite reached the lips, and sometimes, if she waited, something worse. The seat next to her, 1C, remained empty. Occasionally, someone paused near it and checked their ticket before moving on. Then a man white, mid-30s, navy blazer, wired earbuds already unstopped. He tilted his head at her, checked his boarding pass, and smiled awkwardly. "Looks like I'm here," he said, sliding into the seat beside her. "Was wondering who snagged 1D. Amina gave a polite smile. He extended a hand. "Evan, Amina." He settled in, pulling out a laptop almost immediately. She noted his badge tech vest capital, probably headed to Boston for one of the innovation forums. He didn't look at her again, not directly. That suited her fine. From the front of the plane, Jocelyn walked by briskly, collecting empty drink cups from earlier passengers. When she reached Amina's row, she paused again. "Mr. Landon," she said, smiling at Evan, "would you like a mimosa or sparkling water while we finish boarding?" Evan blinked, then looked up. "Sparkling, thanks." Jocelyn handed it to him, then looked at Amina. Her smile thinned. "I'll check the manifest again, just to be sure," she said softly, and walked off. Amina didn't move. She'd been given nothing to drink, no explanation, no offer. Evan looked sideways at her. "Weird," he said. "Don't they usually just offer everyone in first class something to drink?" She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her phone buzzed in her lap. One message. Boarded, eyes open. It was from Dev. Just 3 words, but enough. She didn't respond. She wouldn't need to unless something happened. Until then, she would observe and wait. The boarding door was about to close. A woman older, clearly flustered, rushed into the cabin, holding a boarding pass. "Excuse me," she said breathlessly. "Is this seat 1D? Jocelyn appeared almost instantly, her voice syrup-sweet. "Yes, ma'am. One moment. I believe there's been a reassignment issue. Just let me verify." She turned toward Amina. "Ms. Caldwell, it appears your seat may have been double-booked. If you don't mind, we'd like to relocate you to another seat, so this passenger can settle in before we depart." Evan's eyes widened. The older woman, white, in pearls, and a lavender cardigan, looked uncertain. Amina didn't move. "My seat is 1D, she said. "It was booked and confirmed 2 weeks ago. I boarded early. My ticket was scanned. You returned it to me." "Yes, I understand," Jocelyn said, the smile fraying just a bit. "But sometimes the system—" "No," Amina interrupted. Voice level. "This is my seat." There was no edge in her tone, no defiance, just finality. Jocelyn's lips pressed together. She turned to the woman. "Would you mind waiting just a moment?" The woman nodded slowly and stepped back into the galley. Reed arrived a few seconds later. His face was carefully blank. "Is there an issue?" he asked. "No," Amina said before Jocelyn could answer. "There's no issue." Evan leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on his lap now. "You know," he muttered under his breath, "I think they were going to try to move you to coach. She heard it. She said nothing." Jocelyn and Reed moved away again, whispering with each other at the front. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Drew Dwyer. Looks like we're just wrapping up a minor seating issue and then we'll be ready for takeoff. Thanks for your patience." Amina's jaw tightened. Minor seating issue. She wasn't a problem to solve. She was a person who belonged exactly where she was. She felt the small fire begin to build inside her, not rage, but resolve. She remembered her father's words when she was 14, crying in a high school parking lot after a coach said she was too direct to be a team leader. "Let them be uncomfortable," he had told her. "You don't need to shrink to fit their silence." She took a breath. Slow. Measured. Evan looked at her again. "This is kind of nuts." "Right." She met his eyes. "It's not new," she said quietly. "It's just visible now." The woman in lavender was quietly guided to a different seat. Amina watched her go, not with resentment, but a strange sort of sorrow. The woman hadn't asked to be part of this. She was just placed in the middle of it. A few minutes later, Reed returned with a glass of water and placed it on Amina's tray without a word. No apology, no acknowledgement, just the water. Amina didn't drink it. The boarding door closed. There was a silence in the cabanon that had weight to it, the kind of silence where people pretend not to look, but they do. Evan leaned back. "You ever see that show about power plays in politics? This feels like one of those scenes." Amina smiled, faintly. They usually start just like this. As the aircraft began to taxi, she opened her phone. One text. "Now. Flight 308. She hit send. Then she placed the phone face down on the tray. The wheels lifted off the ground, and Amina Caldwell stayed exactly where she was. 30 minutes into the flight, the cabin had settled into that strange high-altitude stillness. Most of the passengers had tucked into their devices, headphones, or trays of overpriced snacks. Amina, however, remained motionless, her hands resting on her lap, her water untouched. She had sent the message. Now she waited. From the outside, nothing about her looked unusual. She didn't fidget. She didn't stare anyone down. But inside her, the silence crackled like static. She wasn't waiting for justice. Justice was too abstract, too distant, too often postponed. What she waited for was recognition, not of her title or her investment portfolio or the deal she was about to freeze, but of her right to be. Evan beside her had stopped trying to make conversation. He could feel a tooth tension that never quite settled back into comfort. It was strange how a single moment, a single challenge, could rearrange the entire air in a room. You could feel it, even if no one said a word. Then it happened. Darren, the male flight attendant, returned. His tone, this time, was falsely friendly. "Excuse me again, Ms. Caldwell," he said, kneeling slightly beside her seat. "It seems the manifest still shows some discrepancy. We've been asked to verify your ID." She turned her head, slowly. "You've scanned my boarding pass. Twice," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, "but we're required to confirm passenger ID in special circumstances." What circumstances are those? He hesitated. Just for a blink too long. It's just a procedural check. Across the aisle. Evan shifted in his seat again, clearly uncomfortable. "I haven't been asked for anything," he said. Darren didn't look at him. Amina reached into her bag calmly and pulled out her wallet. She handed over her license without a word. He examined it, said nothing, then left. Evan gave a low whistle. "That's ridiculous." Amina gave a small shrug, but the corner of her mouth twitched not from amusement, but from exhaustion. "You get used to the steps," she said. "Scan, check, confirm, recheck, apologize, move on. But you're still in the right seat. That's not the point." Evan looked away, then back at her. So what is the point? Amina turned to him fully now. Her voice was soft, but clear. The point is, they're not wondering if I have the right seat. They're wondering how someone like me got into it. Before Evan could respond, there was a new disturbance. A security officer appeared in the first-class aisle. His presence wasn't loud, but it was jarring blue uniform, wide stance, hand resting too close to his radio. Behind him came Jocelyn, looking like she'd just swallowed something bitter. The security officer walked directly to Amina's row. "Ms. Caldwell, I'm going to ask you to step to the back of the aircraft so we can speak privately." There was a pause. Even the hum of the engines seemed quieter. Amina didn't move. About what he hesitated, clearly not expecting resistance. "We've received a report of non-compliance." Her lips parted slightly. "Non-compliance?" Evan sat up straighter. "She's done nothing wrong." "This doesn't concern you, sir." The officer replied quickly. "It does," Evan said, louder now. "She has a boarding pass. She hasn't caused any disruption." This is ridiculous. Passengers were watching now. Some had removed their headphones. A few were filming. Amina looked up at the officer again. "Do you know who I am?" she asked, not with arrogance, but with a terrifying calm. "No, ma'am," he replied. She smiled. It was the saddest smile she'd given all day. "Exactly." Jocelyn stepped forward, clearly flustered. "Ms. Caldwell, if you don't comply, we may be forced to." Amina held up a hand. "Say forced again. Please." Jocelyn shut her mouth. Amina picked up her phone. She opened a secure app, pressed one button, and held it to her ear. "Flight 308, she said. "First-class cabin. Passenger removal in process. Confirm." There was a pause. Then she hung up. "Someone will be waiting for us at the gate," she said. "And if I'm escorted off this plane, I promise you none of you will ever work a flight like this again." It wasn't a threat. It was a sentence. The security officer stiffened. Jocelyn leaned toward Darren, whispering furiously. Their eyes darted to the back of the cabin, where another crew member was watching. The officer stepped back. "I need to make a call," he said quickly and left. Jocelyn followed. Evan leaned toward Amina. "What did you just do?" She didn't answer immediately. Then, finally I reminded them who owns the sky they're flying through. Evan blinked. "Wait, you're with the airline." She tilted her head. "Something like that." Across the aisle, a young woman had been filming the entire exchange. She nodded at Amina, gave a thumbs up. Her name tag said Isabel. She mouthed something. "Thank you." Amina nodded slightly. Then she turned back to the window, her reflection looking back at her in the glass calm, composed, but underneath, something old and burning. She remembered being 19, flying standby from Oakland to Chicago for a scholarship interview. She'd been pulled aside 3 times, searched, her luggage turned inside out. She'd made it to the interview. Barely. When she got the scholarship, they'd called her a surprising choice. She had smiled then, too. Some things never changed. But today, something had. The intercom clicked again. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're making a brief, unscheduled landing in Atlanta due to a medical emergency reported on board. We'll be on the ground shortly. Thank you for your patience." Evan raised an eyebrow. "There's no medical emergency," he whispered. Amina didn't answer, because she knew what that code meant. They were diverting for optics, so it wouldn't look like they'd landed just to remove her. Smart move. Too late. As the plane began its descent, passengers murmured. Some checked their watches. A few groaned. But more than a handful watched Amina. They didn't know what they were watching yet, but they would soon. She sat back in her seat, eyes closed, and waited. The wheels of Flight 308 kissed the tarmac in Atlanta with a muted thud, jolting the passengers in their seats just enough to pull them from their half-focused screens and sleepy conversations. The captain's voice returned over the intercom, explaining with artificial calm that the plane had landed due to an onboard issue requiring attention and discretion. Amina Caldwell sat motionless in 1D. Her hands rested neatly in her lap, her posture upright. The hum of the engines winding down buzzed beneath the surface, but she wasn't listening to that. She was listening for footsteps. Across from her, Evan stared at her profile. "You good?" he asked quietly. "I've been good," she replied without turning her head. Her voice was even, but inside her, the storm had moved from winds to undertow. That dangerous pull beneath the surface, not visible, not loud, but relentless. She knew what was coming. She had seen this dance play out before in boardrooms, in courtrooms, in corridors and glass elevators. She could predict the shape of denial, the choreography of false apologies. But what had changed was the audience. This time, there were eyes. From row 2, Isabel Rivera angled her phone subtly, still filming. She hadn't stopped. Somewhere in her camera roll was the beginning of a reckoning, and Amina wasn't sure whether that filled her with hope or dread. A voice called from the front of the cabin, "Ms. Caldwell." It was the security officer again, same uniform, same badge, but this time, he looked uncertain, like someone who had just realized they might be on the wrong side of a very public problem. Amina stood. She didn't speak. She reached up, retrieved her bag, and adjusted the strap over her shoulder. The movements were slow, dignified, even elegant. She turned to Evan and nodded once. "Thank you," she said. He didn't answer, just nodded back, his jaw tight. She turned to Isabel. Their eyes met. Isabel pressed a hand to her heart. And then Amina walked, down the aisle, past the whispering passengers, past a man who muttered, "What did she even do?" Past another who took out his phone just in time to catch her back. She felt the eyes, the assumptions, the quiet judgments clinging to her like static. But she walked anyway. Her heels clicked against the thin carpet as she stepped through the galley and out of the aircraft. The jet bridge was cool and empty, except for 2 airport officials waiting at the other end. One of them held a clipboard. The other stared at her too long. Behind her, the door of Flight 308 closed. She was alone, except not quite, because the moment she stepped into the terminal, she saw them. Phones, at least 5, held high, recording, not crew. Not staff, just passengers who had heard murmurs. The story was already spreading like spilled coffee across social media. No one knew the full facts, but they didn't need to. They saw a well-dressed black woman being escorted from first class. That was enough. The security officer motioned toward a side hallway. "This way, please, ma'am." She followed. The hallway led to a small private room with beige walls and a cheap plastic chair. It smelled like recycled air and printer toner. A monitor blinked to life on the wall. Amina sat down without being asked. The officer hovered. "You've got people watching," he said awkwardly. She looked up at him, her voice quiet. "So do you." The door opened again. This time, it wasn't crew. It wasn't TSA. It was legal. 2 men and a woman in sharp suits entered the room. No name tags, no introductions. But Amina recognized the logo on their folders. Viré on Air. They sat down across from her. One of the men cleared his throat. "Ms. Caldwell, we want to sincerely apologize for any stop." she said. They froze. I don't need the speech. Not yet. The woman shifted uncomfortably. We'd like to de-escalate this quickly. You don't get to use that word. Amina replied. I was seated, quiet, cooperative. You escalated. You removed. There was a long silence. We were unaware of your position, the younger man offered. She looked directly at him. And if I didn't have a position, would this have played out differently? He couldn't answer. She leaned forward slightly. You didn't remove a person. You removed a presence that made you uncomfortable. And now, you're trying to manage risk. But what you don't understand is this was the risk. Choosing silence. The woman cleared her throat. We'd like to offer immediate reboarding on a private flight first class. Of course. All expenses. I'm not interested in upgrades. Amina interrupted. She opened her bag and pulled out a thin folder. She slid it across the table. This is a freeze on the pending acquisition agreement between Celestia Holdings and Virion Air. Effective immediately. Pending investigation. The air in the room shifted. You can't be serious, the older man said, suddenly pale. I've never been more serious. The room fell silent. Then Amina stood again. From here, you'll speak to Dev Patel. He's head of ops for Celestia. You'll find he doesn't like being lied to. She turned toward the door. Before leaving, she looked back at the woman in the suit. Start writing your statement, because the world's already writing its own. She stepped out into the hallway. The phones were still filming. Reporters had already gathered outside the security checkpoint. Some recognized her. Some didn't. It didn't matter. She paused. The jet bridge behind her remained sealed. But the sky above, that was wide open. And this time, everyone was watching. Dev Patel was already pacing when the alert hit his phone. It came through the secure channel, coded red, followed by a location ping from Amina's device and one simple message, Flight 308. Incident active. Optics in motion. Dev stopped mid-step and stared at it. He had seen her use that phrase only once before, during a quiet but brutal boardroom takedown of a fintech firm caught redlining black communities through algorithmic bias. That time, her message had said check their credit approvals. Optics in motion. 2 weeks later, the company had dissolved. Quietly. Thoroughly. He opened a second channel and typed, pull all video. Monitor social. Begin timestamp sweep on 308. Prioritize clips featuring Hart, Fox, and Gatecheck. Then he turned to his team. Now. The room came alive. Screens lit up with search grids, algorithmic tracking, and metadata scans. Faces were cross-referenced with employment databases. An AI tool Dev had personally built to scan for discriminatory behavior and airline complaints was now scraping Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, and already content was surfacing. One TikTok from a user named A Truth on Thigo had racked up over 43,000 views in under 20 minutes. The caption read, Black woman gets removed from first class for no reason. Guess what happened next? The video showed Amina's calm walk down the aisle, her bag over her shoulder. Expression neutral but powerful. In the background, you could hear someone whisper, This is going to blow up. Dev clicked the second link. It was a still photo of Amina in the private room in Atlanta. Face half lit, her back straight. The top comment read, She's someone. You can just feel it. He opened Slack and typed to his internal crisis comms lead, Prepare statement. No names, no positions, just core message dignity. Protocol failure, immediate internal review. Pre-clear with legal, but do not delay more than 30 min. Then he dialed. A voice answered. Dev, we have a fire, he said. She lit it, and it's glorious. On the other end, the chief counsel of Celestia Holdings exhaled. Do they even know who she was? Dev laughed, but without humor. They didn't know. But now the entire internet does. He turned back to the screen. Bring up employee files for Jocelyn Hart and Darren Fox. 2 photos appeared. Jocelyn's profile noted 10 years of senior flight attendant experience, 2 internal complaints, 1 informal report of difficult interactions with certain passengers. No follow-up. Darren had been promoted last year. No formal complaints. But Dev's search bot flagged 3 customer reviews that mentioned cold or dismissive behavior toward passengers of color. He flagged both profiles. Then, Dev opened a private email thread with the Celestia board. Subject line delay. Freeze now enforced. He attached Amina's written freeze order and included 3 media links. By the time he pressed send, the story had crossed into the top 10 trending topics on Twitter under Damn Your Seat D. But even that wasn't the surprise. The surprise came when his phone rang. Unknown number, East Coast. He answered, Mr. Patel. This is Maria Sanchez, senior editor at The Atlantic. We've just confirmed an incident involving Virion Air and a prominent executive being removed from her seat on Flight 308. Do you have any comment on behalf of Celestia Holdings? Dev didn't blink. I'll have our PR team send you a statement within the hour. But off record, she didn't just lose a seat. They lost a decade of silence. Maria paused, then said, Understood. He hung up. The PR team stood outside his door, waiting. He opened it. You have 15 minutes. She doesn't want noise. She wants clarity. No fluff, just truth. Someone raised a hand. Are we confirming her identity? Dev looked at the young woman. No. Let the world find that out for itself. She didn't walk off that plane demanding attention. She walked off it demanding accountability. Don't mess that up. They dispersed. He looked at the video again, the one of her walking. There was something sacred in it. Not martyrdom, not heroism. Just presence. And now the weight of that presence was crashing down on Virion Air's corporate office like a wave no one had prepared for. He picked up his phone again. This time, he called her. She answered on the second ring. Hey, she said. You good? I'm steady, Amina replied. Social's lit. We've got 40 million impressions and climbing. I figured, she said. I didn't say anything. That's what's making them scream louder. She was quiet. Then I don't want this to become about anger. I know. I want it to become about structure, about how easily power assumes permission. There was a pause. I'll handle the fire, he said. You just keep walking. Amina exhaled slowly. I'm boarding the return jet, quietly, from a different gate. I'll be in Boston by dinner. Dev smiled. They'll feel that. She laughed softly. Good. When the call ended, Dev turned back to his team. Tell Virion their next move better be truth. Because if they reach for spin, we're bringing the receipts. A map of trending hashtags pulsed on the wall. One had just overtaken Mitcher Seat D. It was a single word. Reclaiming space. And that, Dev thought, is exactly what she did. Inside Virion Air's downtown Boston headquarters, the walls of glass that once symbolized transparency now reflected panic. By 11:08 a.m., the executive floor was crawling with tension. The CEO, Harris Blake, stood at the head of the boardroom table, phone in hand, jaw clenched. The news was no longer just trending. It was omnipresent. Every major network had picked up the footage. There were side-by-side comparisons of boarding scans, policy inconsistencies, and a growing thread about implicit bias within airline culture. And in every frame, the same image appeared: Amina Caldwell, walking with silent defiance down the aisle of Flight 308, escorted for reasons no one could convincingly explain. "She's not even publicly accusing us of anything," Harris muttered. "But that's why it's worse," said Colleen Ritter, Virian's chief communications officer. "She doesn't need to. The silence is the statement. Everyone else is filling in the blanks." The chief legal officer chimed in. "We've got 12,000 tweets mentioning the brand by name in the last 2 hours. More than half are linking us to racial discrimination. The other half are calling for a boycott." Harris threw his phone on the table. It was a seating mistake. "You think this kind of thing hasn't happened before?" Colleen shot him a look. "Exactly. That's the problem." Around the table, silence spread like ink in water. On a side monitor, news anchors were already dissecting Virian's culture, dragging up an internal memo from 5 years ago where budget cuts had shuttered DEI training across flight services. Another leak showed screenshots of customer complaints, dozens regarding differential treatment in boarding and seating, with no evidence of follow-up. Colleen rubbed her temples. "This isn't about one seat anymore. This is about every seat that was denied, downgraded, or questioned, every passenger who didn't look the part. And now it's all laid bare." The monitor blinked. A new tweet had just gone viral. This one from Isabel Rivera. It read, "She didn't say a word. She just stood up, and the entire system started falling. That's what power really looks like." Reclaiming space. Beneath it was the video. Amina's walk. Again. One board member leaned forward. "Who is she? Really?" "She's the founder of Celestia Holdings," Colleen replied. "One of our top-tier equity partners." "Or was," another board member whispered. "She was on the committee for our sustainability grant 2 years ago." Harris stared at the screen. "And we just removed her, like a threat." No one answered. At that moment, Jocelyn Hart entered the room, her posture unnaturally stiff. Behind her, Darren Fox followed, his face pale and tight. They'd both been summoned. "Sit," Harris barked. "They did. Explain." Jocelyn clasped her hands tightly in her lap. "We followed procedure. There was a discrepancy in the manifest. I escalated because what?" Colleen interrupted. "Because she didn't look like she belonged in seat 1D. Darren fidgeted. "We didn't know who she was. And if she'd been anyone else, would you have questioned her 3 times? Demanded ID. Diverted a flight." Colleen's voice cut through the room. Jocelyn's eyes flicked down. "I didn't mean harm. But you caused it," Harris snapped. "To her, and now to us." There was a moment of stillness. Then Harris turned to the legal officer. "Termination protocols, effective immediately." Jocelyn inhaled sharply. "You can't be serious." "I have seniority. You also have a history," Colleen said. 3 flagged complaints, 2 unresolved conflicts, and now the biggest PR nightmare this company has ever seen." Darren started to stand. "So what? We're the scapegoats." "No," Harris said. "You're the symptom." Colleen turned to the room. "You think this is just about optics. It's about patterns. And we trained this behavior into the crew. By our silence, our priorities, our hiring." The room was silent again. Until the door opened. A young assistant leaned in. "Sir, she just released a statement." Every head turned. The assistant tapped a few keys. Amina's words appeared on screen, posted to her personal website. I do not need an apology. I need the system to apologize to every passenger who was overlooked, questioned, or humiliated for not fitting a certain image of belonging. I want acknowledgement, reform, and accountability, not for me, but for the seat I held, and all those who never got to sit in it. No blame, no threats, just truth. The post had already been shared 400,000 times. Harris sat back in his chair, defeated. Colleen leaned in. You want to save this airline? Don't start with a PR stunt. Start with a reckoning. Fire who needs to be fired. Train who needs to be trained. And listen to the people who never get invited to the table unless they buy their way in. Jocelyn and Darren were quietly escorted out of the room. As the boardroom settled into a new kind of silence, heavier, deeper, sobering, Colleen whispered something no one wanted to hear aloud. She gave us a seat at the table, and we made her stand. Amina sat in the quiet lounge of the Hotel Archer in Boston, the city lights casting a faint blue across the floor-to-ceiling windows behind her. She hadn't unpacked yet. The suitcase stood untouched in the corner. Her phone was face down on the table beside her tea. The silence after a storm always carried its own kind of weight. The emails had slowed. The calls, too. Statements had been drafted, posted, picked apart. She had received offers for interviews, keynote appearances, even a docuseries proposal. She ignored them all. She hadn't done this for visibility. She had done it because she was tired of invisibility. And yet, here it was, against Lance. But this time it felt like the breath before something different. Not collapse, not fury, something deeper. A chime broke the quiet. Her phone buzzed, a new email sliding into her inbox. The subject line read, "You won't remember me, but I remembered you. Thank you." Amina stared at it for a long moment before tapping it open. The message was from a woman named Talia Hines. She read Ms. Caldwell. You likely don't recall, but I met you 3 years ago at a networking event in Charlotte. You were standing near the back, sipping sparkling water, listening more than talking. I was a junior recruiter at Virion Air at the time. I'd followed your work with Celestia, read your essays, watched your quiet rise in an industry that rarely makes space for women like us. I wanted to speak to you, but I was too nervous. So I just smiled. You smiled back. That moment stayed with me longer than I expected. A few months after that, I was let go from Virion. No formal complaint was filed, but I had raised questions, quiet ones, about who we were hiring, who got promoted, how performance was measured, about why our cultural fit standard always seemed to lean toward a very specific culture. They told me I wasn't a team player, that I was difficult. I left with a severance and a weight I couldn't name. But when I saw you stand, quietly, proudly, and when I saw the world finally watch, you gave me back something I didn't realize I'd lost. You gave me permission to believe it wasn't just in my head. Thank you, Amina, not for raising your voice, but for never lowering it just to survive. With gratitude, Talia Hines. Amina read the message twice. She leaned back in the armchair, eyes closed. The moments people forget miles, glances, the way you hold space, these were often the seeds of a revolution you'd never see bloom. Talia hadn't needed a rally. She had needed recognition. And Amina, by simply existing in a place she wasn't supposed to, had become that. She replied simply, Talia, I remember the sparkle pin you wore on your lapel. You stood with your hands behind your back, like you were shrinking to fit the room. I saw you. Thank you for reminding me the presence is power, even when it trembles. I'd like to talk. Amina, She hit send. Moments later, another message came through. Not from Talia, from Dev. Subject thought. You'd want to see this. Attached was a single PDF, a former Virion Air employee exit interview. The notes were scanned, handwritten, dated 5 years ago. It was from a woman named Joyce Metcalf, a regional manager. In her closing remarks, she had written, "There's a ceiling here, painted the color of politeness. You don't see it until your head hits it. And when it does, they hand you a brochure about diversity and tell you to be grateful for your seat. I'm leaving because I refuse to sit quietly anymore." Beneath that, in different handwriting, a manager had scribbled emotional, no action needed. Amina stared at those words. No action needed. They were the mantra of every broken institution, the lullaby sung to maintain comfort at the cost of truth. And now, because of one act of calm refusal, those words had finally been dragged into the light. She texted Dev, "Find Joyce. I want to hear her story." He responded in under a minute, already looking. Outside the window, the sky had turned indigo. Amina rose, walked to the glass, and looked down at the city. There was movement everywhere. Cars, people, flickering lights in office towers. Somewhere in all of it, a young girl with questions about her worth was watching this unfold. Somewhere, a man who'd been overlooked 100 times was reading that flight manifest and seeing himself. This wasn't about a seat anymore. It was about who we allow to take up space, about who we ask to prove themselves again and again while pretending the playing field is level. It was about the quiet war of dignity, the everyday resistance of showing up. She turned off the lamp, letting the city light cast its soft glow across the room. Tomorrow would bring more headlines, more spin, more statements crafted by teams of lawyers and PR experts. But tonight, there was only this, one letter, one story reclaimed, and a truth that could no longer be hidden behind policy, procedure, or polite indifference. She opened her journal and wrote, "We are not loud because we want to be. We are loud because silence gave them cover. And today, I took their cover away." The Celestia Holdings boardroom sat at the top of a granite tower in the Seaport District, overlooking Boston Harbor. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the room in morning light, but the faces around the oval table were cast in shadow. Amina entered in silence. She didn't wear her usual power suit. Today, she chose a navy blue turtleneck and soft gray slacks. Simple pearl earrings, no makeup. She wanted no armor between her and the truth. Dev was already there. He stood as she approached, but she nodded at him gently, signaling she didn't want fanfare. Around the table were 12 people, men and women who had stood beside her in 1,000 decisions, deals, and declarations. People she'd mentored, invested in, fought for, and yet, today, their expressions were unreadable. Amina took her seat. The chair at the head of the table, hers remained empty. Deliberately, instead, she sat halfway down the side, at eye level with everyone else. After a pause, Marianne Lowell, the firm's senior strategy director, cleared her throat. "I want to begin by saying we all recognize the strength, the grace, and the restraint you've shown," she said, folding her hands carefully on the table. "Your presence in this moment is undeniable, but we also need to discuss the consequences." Amina raised one eyebrow. Of dignity, Marianne flinched slightly. Of visibility. Another board member spoke up. Jordan Madsen, tech lead, numbers first type. The Virion partnership accounts for over 13% of our aviation portfolio. That's not small. Since your post went live, We've had 3 other partners quietly signal hesitance. Dev frowned. Because we enforced a freeze on a partner who humiliated our founder. Jordan didn't answer. Amina leaned forward, elbows on the table, her voice steady. Let's not pretend we don't know what this is. You're not afraid I acted recklessly. You're afraid I acted publicly. A third voice chimed in Rosa Kemp. Legal advisor. There's concern this sets a precedent. That every incident involving bias will now trigger a freeze or fallout. It should, Amina said calmly. Rosa blinked. That's not how corporate policy is designed to operate. Then redesign it, Amina replied. The silence that followed was deep. No one looked at each other. No one wanted to be first. Finally, Marianne said, Amina, none of us want to diminish what you experienced. But there's the cause, and then there's the company. We built Celestia on precision, on performance. We can't pivot every time someone brings a personal experience to the table. I didn't bring a personal experience, Amina replied. I brought proof of systemic failure. You think this is about me? It's about every employee, every customer, every voice we've silenced in the name of optics and quarterly returns. Jordan spoke again. But your silence has always been part of your brand. You were the one who taught us not to shout, just to act. This feels different. Amina studied him, and for the first time that day, her voice cracked, not with weakness, but with something raw. I've been quiet for 2 decades. Every boardroom I walked into, every backhanded comment I swallowed, every elevator ride where they asked me to push a button assuming I worked there, I was polite, composed, silent, because I thought I had to be, because I believed change came through infiltration, not disruption. She looked down at her hands. But I was wrong. Silence doesn't open doors. It just keeps them shut quietly. Dev leaned forward now, his voice firm. The world is changing, and we're not going to be the kind of firm that punishes truth. Are we? Marianne looked at him, then at Amina. No, she said at last. But we are going to be the kind of firm that weighs risk. Amina nodded slowly. Good. Then weigh this. She reached into her bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper. I had our analytics team run projections. Post-incident sentiment around Celestia is up 39%. Brand trust has spiked. We've received over 6,000 partnership inquiries. People are watching, not because I screamed, but because I stood. She handed the paper to Rosa. And here's what I propose. We build a new equity evaluation protocol, one that measures not just return on investment, but return on inclusion. A metric for whether a partner company treats its people like people. If they don't, we freeze. If they lie, we pull. And if they change, we invest more. The boardroom sat in stunned quiet. Dev broke it with a small laugh. She's turning impact into a KPI. Amina smiled slightly. Let the market catch up. Jordan tapped his pen. That's innovative. Rosa nodded slowly. It's also enforceable. Marianne stared at her for a long moment, then said, You really aren't going to stop, are you? No, Amina replied. Because every time I look in the mirror, I see the girl I used to be. The one who wore borrowed shoes to interviews. The one who knew the seat wasn't meant for her, but sat anyway. She looked around the room. I won't betray her just to make this room comfortable. No one spoke, but something shifted. In the reflection of the glass behind her, the harbor shimmered, and for a moment, the entire boardroom was still not with resistance, but with realization. They were no longer just managing money. They were managing legacy. The lights in the studio were brighter than Amina expected. Cool, clinical, and unforgiving. The kind that washed out color and emphasized every blink, every pause, every unsaid thought. She sat perfectly still in the sleek leather chair across from Nolan Grant, a nationally syndicated host known for his sharp tongue and no-nonsense interviews. He prided himself on pushing guests into confession, spinning vulnerability into ratings gold. Amina had declined dozens of interview requests since the incident on Flight 308. But this one, she'd accepted. Not for herself, but for everyone who still had to explain why they belonged in spaces that should never have excluded them in the first place. Going live in 5, 4, 3. The countdown faded behind the studio glass. Welcome back to Real Talk. I'm your host, Nolan Grant, and today's guest needs little introduction. She's been at the center of a storm shaking the corporate and airline world, a black woman CEO who was removed from her first-class seat, and whose quiet response sent shockwaves across the country. Please welcome Amina Caldwell. Polite applause from the crew. Amina offered a soft smile. Thank you for having me. Nolan leaned in, voice syrupy. So, let's get to it. You've been called many things in the past few weeks. Icon, rebel, corporate threat. But some critics say this was all strategic, that you used your status to create a media frenzy, that this was, in a sense, planned. What do you say to that? Amina didn't blink. I say it wasn't planned, but it was inevitable. Nolan raised his eyebrows. Inevitable. You believe this was bound to happen. I believe that when a system is designed to overlook certain people, eventually one of them stands up and the world finally sees what it's been ignoring. He gave a slight smirk. But you didn't stand up in protest. You didn't shout. You didn't post a video from the tarmac. You left. Quietly. Respectfully. Why not make noise? If you were being wronged, Amina looked at him evenly. Because I wasn't interested in proving my pain. I was interested in proving the pattern. A pause. The studio hushed. Nolan's eyes narrowed. You froze a multi-million-dollar deal. Virion Air is down 12% in stock value. 9 staff members have been placed on administrative leave. Critics say you overreached. You took a personal slight and turned it into a corporate weapon. Amina tilted her head. I didn't use a weapon. I used my position. There's a difference. He pressed. But isn't that the very thing people resent? That only someone in your position could spark this kind of change? What about the people who get removed from seats every day and don't have a platform? Her voice softened. That's exactly why I had to act. Because if I didn't, then what was the point of having this platform at all? What good is power if it doesn't serve those without it? The room grew still. Nolan shifted in his seat. He hadn't expected that. He flipped to another note card. Some executives argue your new evaluation system, what you call return on inclusion, is too idealistic, that it forces companies to prioritize social politics over shareholder interests. Amina smiled faintly. Shareholders are people. People with identities, stories, histories. Inclusion isn't politics. It's protection. And frankly, it's also good business. He gave a short, skeptical laugh. You really believe that I know it. Our inquiries have tripled since we announced it. People want to partner with firms that live their values, not just print them in brochures. Nolan tapped his pen. Let's talk identity. You've been very deliberate about not centering your story around race in interviews, but this incident, undeniably, was about race. Why not speak to that directly? She met his gaze. Because black pain shouldn't be the only time we get attention. I didn't want the world to remember me because I was humiliated. I wanted them to remember what happened when I refused to be. There it was. Stillness again. The kind of stillness that comes not from silence, but from truth settling into a room full of sound. Behind the camera, the producer made a subtle gesture. 2 minutes left. Nolan leaned back. One final question. What do you want people to take from this? What's the message? Amina took a breath. I want people to understand that power doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks like someone standing calmly while the world tries to erase them. I want young girls to know that dignity is not weakness. And I want institutions to understand every seat denied is a story delayed, but not forever. The lights dimmed slightly as the music cue signaled the segment's close. Nolan's voice returned. That was Amina Caldwell, founder of Celestia Holdings and the executive at the center of the Flight 308 incident. Whether you agree with her or not, one thing is clear: her presence cannot be ignored. We'll be right back after the break. The camera light went off. The silence in the room felt different now. Even Nolan didn't speak at first. Then, with a quieter tone than before, he said, "You know, I didn't expect you to be that composed." Amina smiled. That's usually how people underestimate me. He nodded once. Well, thank you. She stood. You're welcome, she said. Next time, maybe ask fewer questions about what I did, and more about why they did it. She walked off the set as quietly as she had boarded that flight, with presence, and for the first time, Nolan had no comeback. Celestia's 11th floor conference room felt colder than usual. It wasn't the temperature, it was the mood. Amina sat at the far end of the table, shoulders relaxed, but her eyes tracking every breath. Dev sat next to her, scrolling silently through his phone. A few board members were dialed in virtually, but most were there in person. The meeting was supposed to be about transition planning, strategic communications, post-crisis stabilization. But the energy had shifted. Not explosive, not confrontational. Worse, doubt. Marianne Lowell cleared her throat. She'd been leading most of the morning's agenda. Polished, careful, diplomatic to a fault. I think we need to start discussing rebalancing, she said, not quite looking at Amina. Amina leaned forward. Define rebalancing. Marianne hesitated, glanced at the virtual attendees, then back at the table. We've lost 3 long-term partners in the last week. Not officially, of course, but quietly. They're citing instability, perception risk. And while we've gained smaller equity opportunities, the scale just doesn't match. Amina nodded slowly. So, you're suggesting I step back? Marianne hesitated again. I'm suggesting that your role might be better served focusing on our new inclusion metrics, that Dev and I handle public-facing strategy moving forward, temporarily. Dev stiffened. Amina didn't. She kept her voice even. So we pivot to equity work, just not equity leadership. No one responded. I see, she said quietly. It's not personal, Marianne added too quickly. It's optics. A way to stabilize perception while still honoring the movement you've sparked. Perception of who Amina asked. The people who saw me removed from a seat and decided I was the disruption. Across the table, Jordan Madsen chimed in. Amina, this isn't about you. You know how much respect we have. But let's be real. You've become a symbol. That's powerful, but also dangerous. Symbols get picked apart, overexposed, misquoted. Amina looked at him, sadness flickering in her expression. I'm not a symbol. Jordan, I'm your colleague, your founder, your leader. And also, Marianne interrupted, the face of a very divisive public debate. There it was, finally said aloud. Not what they feared from outsiders, what they feared from her. Dev broke the silence. You don't pull the pilot when the turbulence hits. You fasten your seatbelt and let them fly. That metaphor assumes the turbulence ends, Marianne snapped, frustration cracking through. We don't know that it will. We've had death threats. A board member's spouse was doxxed. We can't pretend this is just about corporate values anymore. This is national noise. And whose name is at the center of that noise? Amina asked. Mine. The woman you all applauded when our portfolio doubled. When we broke barriers. But now that it's uncomfortable, you want me quiet again. No one denied it. Not out loud. Not anymore. Amina stood slowly, pushing her chair back with grace. She took a breath, then spoke, not with anger, but with truth. I carried this firm through a recession, through 3 mergers, through industries no one believed we could enter. And I did it while being the only black woman in every room that said inclusion out loud and practiced exclusion in silence. I have never, not once, with ego. I led with purpose. She looked around the table. If that makes me a liability now, then so be it. Marianne opened her mouth, but Amina raised a hand. I'm not stepping down, and I'm not stepping back. But I will give you space, not because I agree, but because sometimes silence teaches more than presence. With that, she turned and walked out. Dev followed without a word. They entered the hallway together, the door clicking shut behind them. Cowards, he muttered. No, Amina said softly. They're afraid. That's different. Cowards run. The afraid try to control the chaos. He turned to her. What are we going to do? She looked out the window toward the water. We keep building. We stay grounded. And we remind them that legacy isn't decided in a crisis. It's revealed by it. Dev was quiet for a long moment. Then you want me to cancel the Harvard panel? No, she said. Let them hear me. All of them. He nodded and began tapping into his phone. Back in the conference room, silence settled over the board again. Marianne looked around, her voice unusually uncertain. Did we just make a mistake? Rosa Kemp, the legal advisor, said quietly. We didn't just make one. We just told the world we believe in equity, but not when it's inconvenient. Jordan didn't speak, because he knew it was true. Amina's absence echoed more loudly than any speech she could have given. And for the first time, they understood. She wasn't the problem. She was the proof. The cabin lights glowed soft and gold as passengers filed into Flight 1621, headed from Boston to Seattle. The early morning flight wasn't full, just enough quiet travelers, scattered families, and business people scrolling through last-minute emails before takeoff. Amina settled into her seat, 2A. She hadn't asked for a specific one. The gate agent had offered it with a quiet smile. No fanfare, no mention of who she was. Just a courteous gesture that made her hesitate for a second. But she'd accepted. This flight wasn't about optics. It was about breathing again. Across the aisle in 2C sat a little girl, maybe 7 or 8, feet dangling above the floor. Her hair was pulled back into neat cornrows with red and gold beads that clicked softly every time she moved. Her legs swung back and forth as she hummed some melody under her breath, scribbling into a notebook. Next to her, an older woman, likely her grandmother, was folding a jacket, speaking gently to a flight attendant about tea preferences. The girl glanced at Amina, wide-eyed. Are you famous? She asked without hesitation. Amina blinked, then smiled. I don't think so. You look like someone who's famous, the girl said. You look like you do big things. Amina chuckled softly. That's a very kind thing to say. The girl shrugged. It's not just kind. It's true. What's your name? Amina asked. Imani, she said proudly. It means faith. In Swahili. Amina nodded. A beautiful name. Imani studied her for another moment. You don't look scared of anything. I'm scared of plenty, Amina replied. I just try not to let it stop me. Like what Amina paused. Sometimes I'm scared that if I speak up, people will stop listening. Imani tilted her head, considering that. Then she said, My teacher says that if your voice shakes, it just means your truth is big. Amina laughed softly. Your teacher is wise. She wears sparkly glasses and always says, say it anyway, even when you're nervous. The grandmother returned to her seat then, settling in with a warm smile at Amina. She seemed to recognize her, but said nothing. Not every kind of recognition needed words. As the flight attendants made their final checks, Imani turned back to her notebook. For a while, all that filled the cabin was the hum of engines and the soft clicks of seatbelts. Midway through the flight, as the tray tables came down and drinks were poured, Imani reached across the aisle with a folded page from her notebook. For you, she said simply. Amina unfolded it slowly. It was a drawing row, colorful, childlike. A brown-skinned woman standing with a small cape over her shoulders. All around her were empty airplane seats, glowing like stars. Above it all, in purple crayon, the words, "Thank you for not giving up your seat." Amina stared at it for a long moment. Her throat tightened. You drew this, she asked. Imani nodded proudly. You were on the news? Grandma didn't want me to see it, but I did. You didn't yell or cry or run away. You just stood there, and then they changed things. Amina looked at the little girl. Why did that matter to you? Imani shrugged. 'Cause I want to sit wherever I want to one day, and I think you helped that. Amina folded the paper carefully and placed it in her notebook. Thank you, she whispered. You have no idea what this means. Imani smiled like she understood everything. A few rows behind, a businessman watched the exchange and tilted his head curiously, recognizing Amina too now. But instead of whispering or pulling out his phone, he simply nodded when she looked his way, a gesture of quiet solidarity. As the flight descended over Seattle, Amina stared out the window, watching clouds melt into coastline. She didn't cry, but her chest was full in that unnameable way truth fills you, like breath after drowning. When they landed and passengers began standing, the grandmother reached over and touched Amina's hand. She wants to be like you, she said softly. Not famous, just seen. Amina squeezed her hand gently. Then I'll do everything I can to make sure she always is. As she stepped off the plane, no one stopped her. No one questioned her seat, her ID, her presence. And maybe it wasn't a revolution, but it was something. It was a beginning. The Celestia Holdings boardroom was full again, but this time, not just with executives. There were interns standing quietly by the walls, junior analysts with notebooks open on their laps, a few guests from partner firms. The mood was hushed, electric. Amina stood at the front, not behind the long table, but just in front of it, as if intentionally narrowing the distance between herself and everyone else in the room. Behind her, on a large screen, glowed 4 words, "Every seat tells a story." She let the silence linger. This isn't a presentation, she began. It's a mirror. She clicked to the next slide. A simple chart appeared, tracking Celestia's growth and public trust index over the last 60 days. The numbers spoke for themselves: positive trajectory, unprecedented engagement, and partnership offers from unexpected sectors. Crisis doesn't kill truth, Amina said. It reveals it. And when we chose to respond with alignment instead of apology, the world noticed. Dev stood off to the side, nodding. Amina continued, walking slowly across the front of the room. But metrics don't tell the full story. People do. She clicked again. Up came testimonials, not from executives, but from flight attendants, passengers, young professionals, and students. People who had written in to share how they'd been treated on planes, in offices, in boardrooms, and classrooms places where they were made to feel like temporary guests in spaces they helped build. We used to believe inclusion was about counting heads, diversity checklists, representation in photos, but it's more than that. It's about who feels safe sitting down, about who doesn't have to fight to stay in the seat they earned. She turned toward the board. Which is why I'm asking you to approve the expansion of our return on inclusion metric, not just in aviation, but across all industries we invest in: tech, education, healthcare, every sector that touches lives. There was a long pause. Then Rosa Kemp, who had been the firm's legal backbone for years, stood up. I second the motion, she said clearly. Marianne Lowell, once cautious, raised her hand next, approved. Jordan followed. Then the rest, unanimous. Dev stepped forward. Let the record reflect the motion carries. Amina exhaled, but it wasn't relief. It was release. When the meeting ended, people lingered. They shook her hand, offered quiet nods, even hugs. A few whispered thanks they hadn't had the courage to say before. Some just smiled, the way people do when they finally understood something that had been waiting right in front of them. Later that evening, Amina sat alone in her office. The city lit up beyond the glass. Her desk was mostly clear, but in the center sat the drawing Imani had given her. She picked it up gently. She traced the crayon lines, the little cape, the airplane seats. It was messy, imperfect, and more honest than any strategy memo she'd ever read. A knock came at her door. Dev entered with a tablet in his hand. "You'll want to see this," he said, turning it toward her. It was a video. A high school auditorium, a young girl, black, maybe 15, standing at a podium in front of her classmates. She said, "My name is Raina, and when I was told to sit in the back for a debate meet, I remembered the woman who didn't give up her seat. So I stayed, and I won." The students clapped. A few stood. The camera shook a little, but it captured Raina's smile. "She tagged you in the caption," Dev said softly. Said, "Thanks for teaching me how to stay seated." Amina looked down for a moment, then back up and smiled. Weeks passed, then months. The story shifted, as stories do. New headlines came, new controversies. The media moved on, but the movement didn't. At Veer and Air, the new executive team rolled out a sweeping change in crew training, implement customer dignity reporting channels, and rename their internal program Skyline Protocol, inspired by Amina's quiet defiance. At airports, more passengers began speaking up, not with confrontation, but with calm insistence. They carried truth like boarding passes, not always loud, but impossible to ignore. And at Celestia, young associates began requesting mentorship not just for promotions, but for purpose. Every seat began to look a little different, because it wasn't just about who sat there anymore. It was about how they got there, and whether they could stay. One evening, Amina boarded another flight, this time to Atlanta for a speaking engagement. The gate agent smiled. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Caldwell." She nodded politely and moved down the aisle. When she reached 2A, she paused. Then, gently, she placed her bag in the overhead bin. She sat down. A young man across the aisle looked over. He gave a small nod. "You're her, aren't you?" he asked. Amina smiled softly. "I am." He paused. "Thank you." "For what?" "For making the seat mean something." She looked out the window as the engines began to hum. And this time, she didn't have to brace herself. She belonged. Not because she was famous, not because she was feared, but because she was seen. Because every seat matters. And finally, the world knew why. She never raised her voice. She never made a scene. And yet, through presence alone, Amina Caldwell changed the rules of the sky and far beyond it. From a single flight to sweeping corporate reform. From a young girl named Amani to an entire generation, learning that belonging is not negotiable. This story reminds us that change doesn't always arrive with protest signs or headlines. Sometimes it walks in quietly, sits down in seat 2A, and refuses to move. But let's not forget, what happened to Amina was not unique. It was a mirror, a reflection of the silent, insidious ways discrimination hides in professionalism, in policies, in the gatekeeping of power. If this story moved you, if it made you pause, reflect, or feel seen, then share it. Because every view, every comment, every share is a step toward a world where no one is asked to give up their seat just to be respected. We tell these stories not just to inspire, but to remember that every seat matters, and more importantly, every soul in it. Leave a comment below. Have you ever felt invisible in a space you earned? Please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. More powerful, heart-changing stories are on the way, and you won't want to miss a single one. See you in the next story.